Okay, so very happy to be here. Thank you once again to Islands Innovation, James, all the team, to have organized this another successful event. If I have missed something about the place where you work or any other thing, please feel free to correct that. So, very happy to introduce and to have the discussion today with you. I would like to simply say a few words about how generally, even the panel before us have brilliantly summarized this. Islands tend to be disproportionately impacted by climate change impacts, and both extreme events and the slow onset. So we've been seeing this happening for a long time, but we probably arrived at that threshold where even people outside islands are realizing that this is an urgent issue. Islands tend to be highly vulnerable inherently, right? So we have many things that cannot be changed, like being low-lying or geographically placed in the middle of where many of the events are taking place. So some of these inherent features make small states susceptible to external shocks, which are highly costly, both for societies and economies. Now, notwithstanding this, we know that islands have managed to build strong resilience. However, this resilience, which has been built in the course of the years, comes at a cost. The cost per capita for islands to maintain that resilience, to even run the country simply, is much higher than a larger country, because of course you have to divide the cost per capita, right? And the populations are generally smaller. So this aspect has largely been ignored by the international community in terms of access to finance, and within the countries and territories also, in that regard. Many middle-high income countries, which are islands and small states and SIDS, have borrowed at higher rates and are almost being punished because of their success. So this is something that usually doesn't feel right hearing it, right? But we look at climate finance is almost the norm. So I will start by asking our distinguished guest a generic question on what would be the public and private climate finance aspects that you would like to being considered to bring an effective climate finance for islands that is meaningful at islands level. So I know it's a generic question, perhaps a bit too hard, but what are the key aspects that you think could be considered and are not considered, both in the public and private climate finance at the moment? We'll start with you. Lisa, thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I think in terms of the public side of things for the Cayman Islands in particular, it's understanding where the instruments actually are for us to be able to access. As we heard in the last panel, it's been extremely difficult for us to be able to access the formal mechanisms. And once we even do have access to that, it has been very much in terms of a project level rather than programmatic funding on an ongoing basis. So that's been one of the issues for us. In terms of what we would apply that to for resiliency, we're still in the stage of capacity building on that side of the fence. We have climate data, climate risk assessments been performed. We understand, for the most part, what our immediate risks are, and perhaps for the next 20 to 30 years, and maybe even longer term than that. But in terms of understanding what the cost of adaptation and resiliency will be for the public sector, and being able to have that costed on an ongoing basis in the annual budget is still quite a challenge for us, and not just in the ministry that I work, which is sustainability and climate resiliency, but intertwining that with the Ministry of Finance and getting the capacity built in the Ministry of Finance and risk and budget units. In terms of the private sector side of things, we have a long and very robust history of working with the private sector when it comes to disaster preparedness and response mechanisms, and even down so into at the community level. And so we're very fortunate that we have those lessons that are already learnt and that institutional capacity that exists there in terms of public-private partnerships. And again, it's to be able to understand where the private sector is best placed to be able to filter in and crowd into those spaces where we know we will need help, or that the government will just technically not have the technical capacity, right, nor have the financial wherewithal to do everything that we know that needs to be done. I'll just leave it there for now. Pass on to you.
Kate, please.
Thank you. So, you know, when we think about the climate finance challenge, there's potentially two big issues. There's capital availability and there's capital absorption. And you know, I think in the climate finance world, there's this interesting contradiction that we both have a lot of money being raised for climate, but also not enough. And the money that is available is not always reaching great opportunities, and I'm speaking from more of the private sector side, great investment opportunities, particularly in small island developing countries and other markets. You know, we can say a lot about the macro issues that can lead to these challenges around capital absorption, but you know, we focus primarily on, in what I might speak to here, the transaction level barriers to financing. And so, you know, this is asking why, when we look at the business opportunities in some of these markets, why do we have great businesses that aren't able to access these? You know, every day there's a new climate fund raised. Why are they not able to access some of this funding? And you know, we look at these transaction level barriers in two buckets. We look at the challenge of lack of capital for the risk return profile, and we look at transaction cost, the latter being obviously incredibly important in the context of smaller deals. Right? If you raise a couple $1 billion fund, you have to have very large investments, and many of the deals that actually need funding are not at that level and shouldn't be at that level. On the side of the lack of capital for risk return, I think it's especially important to differentiate between real risk and perceived risk. And then also to acknowledge the role of pioneering transactions and things that are being done for the first time, where this might be a purely commercial opportunity, but it hasn't been done, or it's the only deal in this sector in this country, and so it's not an obvious target for an investor. I'm happy to dig more into that issue, but yeah, just to really put to the forefront this challenge around capital absorption specifically.
Laverne, please.
All right, thank you. Afternoon, everyone. To state this opportunity to thank Island Innovation, Island of Hope, for allowing me to be on this panel. And, you know, this is a very, very important topic for all. And I'm speaking particularly for persons in the Caribbean region. I'm from the CARICOM Development Fund, and we serve 12 member countries in the Caribbean community. Now, in response to the question, there are certain aspects in terms of, and I am happy the keynote minister spoke just before this panel, because we in the Caribbean, we are on the front line on the war on climate change. And on that front line, we have where, even outside of the Caribbean, you find where communities, countries will be getting hotter, cyclones will be getting heavier, the hurricanes will be getting stronger, and that's what we've been experiencing in the Caribbean. Now, we recognize that there are significant liquidity, excess liquidity in the region, within the financial institution system in the Caribbean. Excess liquidity is there. Even outside of the region, we have excess liquidity. How do we tap into that excess liquidity is the question. And from the private sector perspective, we recognize that if, from a commercial perspective, if you're a business and you're looking to invest and you're not seeing the commercial viability of a project, then there is no scope for a private investor to partake in these types of projects. So it's important to identify the viability of the project, the feasibility of the project, to basically crowd in private sector resources. From the public sector perspective, we typically find that, especially since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments within the Caribbean normally have limited fiscal space. And within that context, they've been borrowing. We have high debt to GDP. So you find that there isn't much scope or capacity of member governments to be tapping into these type of projects. We talk about building resiliently, and what is needed is for that disconnect or that disparity between who takes on what. So the private sector really should be taking on those commercially viable projects, and the public sector to tap into those that are not commercially viable and considered what we call public good, but is needed to build resilience in our communities. So I'll pause here for the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. You all raised, from your perspective point of views, important points regarding also the scale at which certain funds or decisions between, before accessing or going directly to those funds are taken. So I'm wondering whether the specific characteristics of islands, which make them really sometimes a unique socioeconomic environment, with some would call them a lot of market failures or an important role of the state to be present, because of course certain goods and public goods can only be provided, of course, within the important role of the state. So I'm wondering if you think that there are the current mechanisms of climate finance look at the specific characteristics of islands or ignore them, because my impression also from some of the research we've been looking at, there are benchmarks and there are decisions that are taken which are set within larger states and then simply applied to small islands or islands in general, without considering that perhaps the scale at which that investment has to be done or the decision to be taken is different. So I'm wondering whether you have experienced anything of this and if you have perhaps any proposed solutions to it.
Well, personally, no, because this is all very new to us, UK overseas territories in particular, who have been locked out of this climate finance dialogue for quite some time. But I can say that you're absolutely correct, and I think we heard this in the last panel too, in terms of the eligibility that shouldn't just be on whether you have a constitutional arrangement that allows you to have access to these types of funding, but based on demonstrated vulnerability, principles of climate justice, for example, and using different metrics in order to be able to quantify and access these types of funds. Most recently, a 2021 report of the MVI, and the Cayman Islands scored or was ranked amongst the top 30 most vulnerable countries in terms of the structural dimension. Again, for all the reasons we spoke about before, remoteness, large remittances, exiting the country, a leaky tourism pillar of the economy, etc. So in terms of that, in terms of slow onset that you spoke about, another study, UNDP study just out this year, under a medium and high emission scenario, by the end of the century, we'd be looking at something between 12 and 16% of the land mass under sea level. So it's those types of indices that we need to be looking at in order to be able to access these types of funding, be it public or private, and be able to apply that, rather than just whether you're eligible for a fund or not, GCF or otherwise. And I think that's where, perhaps for the Cayman Islands, the private sector is where we need to look to focus some of these efforts.
Thank you. Very clear. Kate, please.
So I think on the private side, this is exactly hitting the nail on the head, right? The pools of capital that are available are not designed for projects and companies in island nations. And there's a couple of specific barriers there. On the side of investors, I think what's often missed is it's actually really hard to deploy a lot of capital, especially in geographically diverse areas where there's maybe only one or two potential deals in each location, right? The fund manager needs to have expertise in that market, which they may not have looked at before. They need to have good deal flow. They likely need to have some boots on the ground. We've mentioned just just how far a flight is to some of these potential destinations. And on the other side of the deal, you have often companies or projects that may be commercially viable, but have never before had access to investment, don't have the relationships to get in the right rooms to ask for capital. And once they're in those rooms, they don't necessarily have that past experience of what is fair, what is not fair, what is a good market term, and so the result of that is a lack of trust on both sides. The investor doesn't know that they're seeing the actual best deals in the region. They don't have the bandwidth to invest the extra effort to get up to speed on a new market or a new sector. And the entrepreneur also is not sure that they're not being taken advantage of. Now, solutions that I would point to, maybe two specific ideas. One is the work that we do at Cross Boundary, which is really about investment facilitation, supporting both the buy side and sell side of the deal as a neutral intermediary, funded by donors, right? This is a public good that you are creating, and being able to bridge those gaps. And the second is the creation of fit-for-purpose investment vehicles, right? The inertia from existing vehicles is not leading them to island states. Something has to be done to actually put the focus on these geographies and these opportunities. That typically comes with an additional cost. Someone has to pick up that cost, but we absolutely need that. And I hope we'll hear more about some not a leading question, but hope we'll hear more about some specific fit-for-purpose vehicles being designed in the Caribbean and elsewhere.
Excellent, Kate. You set me up on that one. So just in terms of the official response to the question, and I think that's an excellent question, because I'm peeved in some instances when we see all these grant funds, these wonderful names, we're all for climate change, these billions of dollars, but we're not seeing the impact. Because for me, and for us in the Caribbean community, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And one of the problems we're seeing with where these funds are housed or hosted is that you have this global fund that's targeting the entire world. And when you look at the specifics and the uniqueness of various regions, and this is where Kate really set me up, it has to be fit for purpose. Fit for purpose in the sense that you want to be able to build something for the people, of the people, by the people. And what that means is that you have to take into consideration the socioeconomic, the political, the cultural, and the absolute geographical location of the respective islands in the Caribbean community. So that is of importance to us. What we've done and what we find that is important also is that if you create a resilience investment vehicle for the people, by the people, of the people, and crowd in those multilateral resources that would now be fit for purpose, I see that as an excellent and a more efficient way, rather than trying to go from that top level down. It has to be also bottom up. So in that regard, I think it's important for us to be collaborating on that effect, rather than trying to make good from the top level down. Thanks.
Excellent. So we're getting somewhere here in terms of identifying both the gaps and the barriers and the possible solutions. Now, as you of course know, from day one here we had quite of a day one of the COP. The loss and damage fund being agreed and started to be pledged by many countries. So before asking you your opinion about this specific fund and some of the nitty-gritty about it, I would like to take us back to how the other international funds, like the Adaptation Fund, the GCF, has worked so far, which, especially for islands, has not been great, just to paraphrase something a bit nicey. So we have experienced delays in which, that from the beginning of the project, and sometimes, it's been implemented after 3, 4, or 5 years time. So there is a long delay, and in those years, other disasters might have happened, or the dynamics of islands might have made it impossible to contextualize the beginning of the project to that end. So we have a matter of timing. We also have the experience of trickling down to real the actors that are facing climate events and trying to increase their preparedness, not receiving sufficiently the help that those funds were created at the beginning for. So this little preamble to ask you, what would you like to see, if anything different, from the new Loss and Damage Fund?
Well, first of all, I would like for us to be able to actually access it, because we can't access that. We haven't been able to access GCF, as I said before, Adaptation Fund, none of that. So that has been an extremely difficult challenge for us to be able to write grants, build the capacity to be able to write grants, access other grant funding. The majority of our work has come directly from the United Kingdom government and or the EU, which the situation we now find ourselves in outside of Brexit means that the EU funding is drying up after EDF 11 projects come to a close in the next few years. So first and foremost, we would be able to access those funds. That would be a huge win for us. But secondly, as I said before, it would be building our capacity in order to be able to have investment-ready projects, because we haven't had that necessarily. The types of projects that have been implemented have been small grant-style projects, one and done, not ongoing programmatic. That has basically centered around data collection, systems, early warning systems, that type of thing, institution building, technical expertise where it can. So I would like to be able to sit, not necessarily here, but in a couple of COPs' time, and be able to say that, yes, we have accessed those funds. They are now coming through intermediaries as well that we are also able to access, because that's been the other side of the coin for us as well, in that the intermediary and accredited institutions, again, as United Kingdom Overseas Territories, we are not full members too, so that is yet another barrier for us. So it continues, and I'll just pass it to my other colleagues.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in brief, just echoing the previous point, that as new capital comes online, really thinking about how this capital can reach real opportunities. This is a whole other side of things I've not had to fully consider, and it's absolutely incredible that is not the case today. Hopefully that is fixed first and foremost. But yeah, I think just upstream work on preparing projects, and really critically, one thing that we see is very important, because the conversation in these conferences is often, there's not enough investable opportunities, we need more upstream. We've heard this story before, but as those resources to support upstream come online, making sure that that's directly linked to funding, as opposed to support that's not really informed by what does the investor or the loss and damage fund or whatever that entity is need to see to actually put money to work. There's often that disconnect.
Yeah, so from where I sit in the Caribbean region, what's important is that we have instances where, by the way, the CDF has just been recently accredited by the GCF. So we know what it means to get accreditation. And it goes back to your point that having intermediaries within the member states, within countries, or even partner institutions will make access to some of these, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's grant funding or loans, make it that much easier in terms of the actual beneficiaries receiving it. What's going to be also important is flexibility being built into the modalities of these access, because we find that there is too much bottleneck, too much red tape, too much bureaucracy involved in getting access. The application alone can take forever. I mean, we're talking about building resilience. If we're to respond to a hurricane, for example, imagine going through a GCF application to get funding for that. Now, by the time the hurricane hits, we're long gone. You know, by the time a severe disaster should take place, we're long gone. So flexibility has to be built into these modalities, accessibility, and also the mere fact that the access to finance has to be affordable. So these are some of the critical factors to be considered where we sit. Because, and I'll give you an example. Dominica, consider Dominica, that's really on the core front line. In 2011, Dominica was hit by Hurricane Ophelia, and that basically took out about 15% of the GDP. 4 years thereafter, tropical storm, this was just a tropical storm, Erica, it took out another 20% of Dominica's gross domestic product. And then 4 years after that, we had another hurricane hitting Dominica, 220% of Dominica's GDP. Now, you're looking at an aggregate of 7 to 8 years. And that pretty much is like an average timeline, as you mentioned, of an application to get through, just to get the basic financing to hit. 220% of a country's GDP being eroded over an 8-year period, and to get access to finance to mitigate or to build adaptation against that. I'll leave you with food for thought on that. Thank you.
Well, you know, I was wondering whether usually when there is a gap in terms of accessing funds, right, especially public and international climate finance, there are good efforts by both private entities as well as public to create partnerships to try to fill that gap. Of course, sometimes with cost, but naturally lower than waiting for 8 years to access something that would help you to rebuild your economy and society. So, Kate, I would like to start with you by asking you if there are such gaps, especially from islands and both independent and non-sovereign territories. Why is that the private institutions, of course, have not perhaps sufficiently considered creating effective partnerships with the public entities in those islands to fill that gap that is there for us to do it? Of course, it's not an accusation, it's not a genuine question to ask whether perhaps there is something that maybe even public entities should reconsider in starting these partnerships, and whether they make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reflection I was just having as you were speaking before as well is, I think it's important to really think about this as a capital stack of sorts, right? It's not a one size fits all. Right? GCF funding is great for some things, probably not great for rebuilding immediately after a hurricane, just given timelines, for example. And so I think in thinking about the kind of partnerships that might be relevant, really it is, I think, building this map of how do we get private sector capital in to, public capital is an extremely limited and valuable resource. And so the more we can bring other sources in, the better. I think one of the areas that we haven't discussed yet that is also relevant here is insurance. And there have been some really interesting proposals in the context of loss and damage for how can you have financing set up in advance for the kind of situation you described in Dominica, where, if GCF and some of these, private sources of capital really for that size, you're talking about insurance. And so I think that's potentially one less explored area. But the premiums would need to be covered by developed countries, in my opinion.
Very good. Laverne, I would like to ask you whether there is something that perhaps, looking at this from your point of view, perhaps public entities in general could engage, and how, with the private sector to fill that gap?
Yeah, so it goes beyond just the public sector and the private sector engaging. What we need are the right types of partnerships. So an example, which is very current, we've partnered with the USAID, who has provided technical assistance to us, where cross-boundary advisory through Kate and her team, they have been assisting us in structuring the appropriate investment vehicle for resilience in the Caribbean. And with that type of partnership, what it does, it's aimed to crowd in private sector resources to facilitate and invest in public sector type projects. So it's a mix of the two, wherein we're looking at those commercially viable projects, but at the same time trying to target the non-commercial viable type projects. While we need, at the same time, to be able to facilitate public-private partnerships, because there are instances where the private sector will not be taking on certain type of projects, but the public sector really is the one that is able, and is responsible for that, while the private sector is the one that has the resources to fund these types of projects. It's important that from the top down, bottom up, once these facilities are created, and we've done that in just recently, just yesterday we introduced for the first time the CARICOM Resilience Fund, where the intent really is for us to crowding those type of private resources aimed at filling those gaps wherein, because we typically find that the multilateral financial institution and development banks target a certain ticket size in terms of projects. And given our geographical space, given our size in the Caribbean, we're pretty small. And our projects are pretty small. We are very fragmented, separated by the ocean. And we find that some of our projects typically don't attract the appropriate type of funding that is available in terms of what is out there for the typical investor. And this fund in particular that we've specifically structured for the region, by people of the region, and that will be managed of people of the region, is important for us to attract those type of resources coming in so that we can deploy appropriately. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
If I could just add one other comment, because I think, we talk, this is a great example of a blended finance fund, and I think it's great that we're hearing more and more about the role of blended finance in this space. And I think one thing that's quite important is just the recognition that, by definition, that is bringing together very different partners, and there is also a cost to that. And so, thinking about the role of entities like USAID or other donors, not just in coming into the fund itself as first loss capital or guarantee or other instruments, but also the design and preparation of this sort of facility, and just aligning players who probably haven't worked together before, should be, but just not to underestimate the challenges in setting that up. But once you've done it once, it becomes easier and more replicable.
Isan, what is your point of view on the private and public partnership? What can we do better?
Well, as I said before, we're fortunate in the Cayman Islands that we have had a long history of that, and that has seemed to work well. And even in terms of the response to the coronavirus and the pandemic, and we've seen philanthropic capital especially be mobilized really quite quickly in the Cayman Islands for ongoing resiliency on that side of things, which I think could serve us well for the climate change debate, and be able to maybe even transition some of those same institutions operating in the country and be able to attract even more regional as well as global finance through them, because they are working very much at the community level, which is, of course, where you want adaptation and resiliency to really be taking place from the bottom up, as we've been saying before. And we've also been very fortunate as a government to have the CRIF funded, the CRIF fund housed in the Cayman Islands, and that has had its own interesting debate locally as well in terms of whether it's really working for us in terms of the rapid response, providing liquidity, most definitely, not necessarily when we needed it, which was at first 2004, the passage of Hurricane Ivan the Terrible, as it's still known today, that wiped out in a 24-hour period 183% of our GDP from 2003. But afterwards, and when the fund was established, we've been able to benefit from that, but not all the time have the parametric system necessarily worked for us in terms of where the impact has been respective to the populations that have really been affected. So Grand Cayman being our most populous island, it's fine, but if our sister islands are hit, then, and they don't hold the majority of the population in the country, it may not necessarily trigger that access to that fund for that liquidity, for that immediate response. And then, of course, going forward, it's not necessarily the instrument to be used for ongoing programmatic adaptation and resilience building.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we came right at the end of our event. So I think we have had a very good discussion on identify the problems, the barriers, but also some of the possible solutions, like some of the funds that are being proposed and hopefully worked on both from the private and public and together partnerships that perhaps could start to address more effectively issues that are really important at islands level. So once again, thank you very much for your contributions, and a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.